The Exorcist Believer has been released, and over the last little while, I've gone through the entire franchise and reviewed each entry, so I thought now that we're through with that and we've got the new movie, let's rank all 6 movies that have been released up to this point in the Exorcist franchise. I'll have the individual reviews linked in the cards, whichever side that's going to be on, and also linked in the description if you're interested. Worst to best, here we go.
That contact between us came about through your machine.
Well, whatever it was, it saved the children.
Not even a competition. This has been the worst Exorcist sequel since 1977, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. It is baffling that this movie exists. How did no filter along the line of production catch this movie and expel it to the fiery pits of hell that would probably have spit it back out anyway? I would say I'm being overly dramatic and that it's not actually that bad, but I don't know if that's the case. There's some stuff early on in the movie that's still dumb, but I can have a good time with because of how insane it is. But then, as the movie goes on, it's like every scene is trying to one-up the last in stupidity. You've got things like the ghost of Father Marin talking to Father Lamont and telling him how special Reagan is and that he has to look after her. That there's that whole thing about Reagan being a healer, the situation with Kakumo. It's also weird. There's this sort of like weird psychedelic dreamy tone to the movie, and I can appreciate that in a way. I know this movie has its fans, and I'm really trying to acknowledge why people enjoy it. I understand it to a degree. I will say, and this is something that I neglected to get into in my review, the score from Ennio Morricone is really great. Some of the themes are beautifully haunting, but it doesn't save the rest of the movie from being the incoherent mess that it is. I get the appeal, and there is a part of me that is morbidly fascinated by this movie. I didn't hate watching the movie. I was just in a state of awe from how bad it was.
So you think I'm a thief? Now you think I'm a thief and a whore.
You know, I think depending on the day you ask me, I could either tell you that this movie is a painful slog or it's a disposable candy horror movie. It feels like a movie you'd find while browsing cable at 2 in the morning in 2006, and sometimes that's exactly what you need, but usually this is just a really bland, below average horror movie. The situation with this in Dominion is one of the most bizarre production stories I've ever heard, and if you want to know more about that, I talk about it in detail in my review for Beginning. I think it starts out with some promise, and Marin's backstory with the Nazis is actually pretty intense, but it feels like this movie is trying way too hard to let you know that it's scary, but it never actually is. It's like they saw the boundary-pushing elements of the original and said, fuck it, let's just rip some kids apart and fucking burn diseased babies like we're a 14-year-old goth trying to write an edgy movie. To be fair, Dominion also had the baby back ribs, but that sort of thing happens a lot more in this movie. I like it more than Heretic because, and this says a lot about Heretic, the characters are better developed and the story is a lot more interesting. It doesn't feel as cosmically stupid, but again, that's a very low bar. It's a bad movie, but it's a disposable and very entertaining schlock horror movie that didn't kill me to watch. The climax of this movie is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in a horror movie.
The body in the blood! The body in the blood! Catherine! The body in the blood! Catherine!
To be very clear, I don't think this is an amazing movie. The response that I got on my Believer review made it seem like people are thinking that I thought this was like a great movie. I don't, but there's enough about it that I did like that makes me very comfortable putting it where it's at on my list. What it really comes down to for me is the feel of this movie, especially through its first act where it's building up the tension and a sense of dread before things get really crazy. The performances from Lydia Jouett and Olivia O'Neill were really great, and they delivered some chilling moments through both delivery and body language that I genuinely found to be a step above many possession movies. Bringing back Ellen Burstyn is a really cool idea, and it's fun to see her back in the role, but she's not used in a very interesting way. This doesn't have nearly the same gravity that bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis to play Laurie Strode does. It's just, they're just trying to, check off that requel box. I got really excited when she mentioned that she wasn't actually in the room during Reagan's exorcism, because that opened a door to some great character exploration that unfortunately didn't get explored, at least not in this first chapter. It just feels like there were way too many things crammed into this runtime, and none of them got the attention they needed to make any of it stand out, which really sucks because some of the ideas presented could have been really interesting. The idea of choice is something that's brought up in a way that I thought was actually really great at the end of the movie, but the whole third act feels so rushed and forced into a box by trying to play things way too safe that the idea didn't get explored much. I still fully stand by what I said in my review, that this is nowhere near as bad as a lot of people are making it out to be, but it's a generic studio-produced requel that feels really uninspired, and if Blumhouse does decide to go forward with this trilogy, I hope whoever's at the helm does something unique.
I believed God let us decide between good and evil. I chose good. Evil happened.
There are certainly days where I might prefer to watch Beginning because it's just dumb fun, but there's absolutely no way I can honestly say that it's a better movie than Dominion. If you're not aware of the story with Dominion and Beginning, the simplest way I can put it is that they're the same premise with wildly different executions. This movie's a far more character-driven story with more thematic depth that was actually explored quite well. It can be a little dull at times, but it feels a lot more in line with the original than Beginning did, and there are some really interesting stylistic choices with the ending. I wouldn't say it's an amazing movie by any means, but it's definitely the most cohesive telling of the exorcism in Africa that we heard about in the original movie. My biggest issue with it is definitely the way it's paced and in some of the performances, because in order for proper character work to be effective, you need to have performances that can convince you these are actual people, but some of it falls really flat, so those moments can be hard to stay engaged with. Not the worst movie, doesn't upset me, but it's also not one I'm gonna shout from the rooftops. I was juggling a bit between this and Believer because there's a lot with the visual style and the build-up in the first act of that movie that I really liked, but what made me settle here is that Dominion has much better character development, more interesting narrative, and it feels a lot more unique than Believer. Only time will tell where it'll settle, but let's move on to my favorite sequel in the franchise.
There you go, blaming God.
Who should I blame? Phil Rizzuto?
You wouldn't want to live forever.
Yes, I would.
No, you wouldn't. You'd get bored.
I have hobbies.
It feels weird putting this one spot away from Dominion, but just to be very clear, the gap between number 3 and number 2 is huge. I should almost have like 7 ranked spots so I could use one as a blank space to create more of a gap. It's damn near impossible to make a sequel to something like The Exorcist feel like it has a reason to exist beyond trying to ride the coattails of its success, but The Exorcist 3 is one of the only ones that's done that properly. It's a story that was written because the man who wrote the original had an idea for a continuation, not because the last one was really successful, and that makes all the difference. This movie has some of my favorite dialogue scenes between two characters in all of film, and as the murder mystery unravels, the reveals are so creepy and cool and disturbing, and then you've got these insane performances from George C. Scott and Brad Dourif that make this movie almost perfect. The jump scare with the cloaked figure with the shears is one of the most well executed and iconic jump scares in film, and that scene is really what the movie's become known for, despite how good the rest of it is. It's a brutal and sad story that closes on a pretty bleak ending, but I do like to think that Kinderman finds some sort of peace after this. I was under the impression that pretty much everyone was on the same page about this movie, but clearly some people aren't all that fond of it, which is surprising to me, but hey, it's all personal opinion at the end of the day. Now on to what you all knew was coming.
Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon, she says she's the devil himself. Now, if you've seen as many psychotics as I have, you'd realize that's the same thing as saying you're Napoleon Bonaparte.
Unmatched. This is the greatest possession movie ever made, and it's not only one of the best horror movies of all time, I would easily say it's flat out one of the best movies. It's just this perfect storm of writing, directing, acting, editing, and score that makes up a final product that is essentially untouchable, and I don't see anything coming even close to it. Damien Karras is one of the best characters put to film, and when you've got people like Kinderman flawlessly expressing the themes of a film in such a natural way, it almost feels like you're watching a documentary at times because of how immersive it is. It was a movie that was controversial when it came out because no one had seen anything like it, and I think it's still unsettling to this day, not because of the big crazy moments, but because of the thematic implications and the quieter moments. It's just perfect, and if I could get a cut where the outing on Reagan's birthday was added back in and everything was the theatrical cut up until the very end so I could get that scene with Dyer and Kinderman, I think world hunger would end. I saw this for the first time when I was 12 years old, but revisiting it as an adult made me see just how much depth was lying below the surface of this movie. The word masterpiece is thrown around way too much, but The Exorcist is one that genuinely does deserve that title. So there you go. That's my personal ranking for the Exorcist franchise. The masses have clearly been very vocal about the new entry, and I'm starting to question what the hell Blumhouse is going to do going forward. They paid $400 million just for the rights to the IP, so they've got to do something to try and make some of that back, but I don't see them making a return. Oh well, if the trilogy does continue, I'll make an updated ranking once Deceiver comes out. This is one of the weirder franchises in horror because you go from absolute untouchable top-tier masterpiece to total dogshit slop to disposable candy movie, so I guess you could say there's a lot of variation. It's nowhere near as consistent as things like Evil Dead or Scream, but its high notes are untouchable. So that concludes my coverage of the Exorcist franchise for now, until I go back and do the cut comparison video for the original and maybe Legion at some point down the line. And I'd also like to take a look at the Exorcist TV series because I remember seeing a bit of it years ago and I'd like to revisit it. But we've still got plenty of October left and I've got lots of stuff coming up. My last few videos have been pretty controversial, so I figure it's time to move on to something that's a little less so, to relieve some stress. Thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.